The trouble with government debt is at some point it has to get repaid. So people get very, very nervous at high levels of government debt. And of course, since the financial crisis, we've seen government debt increase enormously. Although that said, over the last 300 years, actually where we are now is about the average. The first question is, what is the right level for government debt? The second is, what type of debt should governments issue? And if you think about the size of government debt, well over £1.5 trillion in the UK, it's kind of a very big missing hole in the academic research. So we've got 321 years of government debt data. So starting in 1694, which is when the Bank of England was set up. Basically in the 18th century, there's a series of wars which pushed the debt up to really high levels, so 2 or 3 times the level that we see today. Then in the 19th century, that's brought down by the government running fiscal surpluses. 20th century comes around, and of course you get 2 world wars that push the debt level up. And in the 20th century, the UK government uses inflation rather than running a fiscal surplus to pay back the debt. Then of course, most recently, we've seen the debt rise again when we had a financial crisis. And the big issue is, why has the debt increased so much? And would there have been a different type of debt that governments could have issued to mitigate the effects of the financial crisis? There's a whole raft of different assets, but in general you look at short debt or long-term debt. And what's very striking about UK debt today is it has an average maturity of 15 years. That's about twice as much as any other country in the world. And this is because we've got lots of pension funds in the UK who want to buy that long-term debt. And long-term debt has been very, very cheap. And for that reason, that's why we have this very long maturity. But we find that over the last 150 years, the really long debt actually has been quite an expensive way of borrowing. And there's a couple of reasons why that's the case. The first is, in general, it's cheaper to borrow at the short end than it is the long end. And we've got this very long-term debt, so we've been paying a lot more than for short debt. And what's happened over the last 10 years is bondholders have done really well. During the financial crisis, long bondholders have done the best they've done in our 350-year sample. There's been a really big increase in bond prices. And if you look at the cost of government borrowing, it's not just the cash they pay every year, it's also the increase in the price of those bonds that investors hold. So one of the things we found really striking was, if you look since 1997, had the government just issued 3-year bonds compared to, say, 10-year bonds, then debt would have been much, much lower. In fact, issuing 3-year bonds would have seen government debt today be 20% of GDP less than it actually is. That's because those long bonds have just increased so much in value that issuing shorter bonds would lead a lower value of debt today. So one of the things that we've seen from our data set is that we've coped with this level of debt before several times, but there's really 2 ways that we have brought the debt back down again. One is through surpluses and one is through inflation. So if you think about the next 30, 40 years, which is probably the time frame in which the government will have to bring down that debt, it says there's 2 ways of doing it: running fiscal surpluses or running higher inflation. We'll have to see which one it is, but I suspect we will see higher inflation in the next 20, 30 years than we've seen the last 20 years. That'll be a big way in which the debt is brought back under control.